They thought the case was closed. For 20 years, the town of Hawthorn believed Lily's killer was behind bars. But when investigators pried open a forgotten motel drawer, they uncovered a shoebox that changed everything. Inside were Polaroids no one was ever meant to see. Lily wasn't alone in those pictures. Smiling beside her were the town's most trusted men, the pastor, the beloved coach, even the bar owner. The same men who had baptized children, cheered Friday night games, and prayed with grieving families were suddenly exposed as monsters hiding in plain sight. And the final twist? An anonymous envelope arrived with a Polaroid of Lily, alive, laughing, and a chilling note. "We're sorry." What happened in Hawthorn would shatter every belief the town held. Before we dive deeper, hit subscribe and like for more cold cases and chilling mysteries. The town woke up to the sound of handcuffs at dawn. They said the noise traveled through Hawthorn like a rumor, thin, urgent, impossible to stop. It seeped through houses with peeling porches and through the hospital, where night nurses traded sleepy, uncertain glances. It washed over the river the way mist does. Slow, absolute. People stepped out into their yards in slippers and sweaters and asked each other the same question, without knowing why they already feared the answer. Who? On the 3rd day of June, 21 years after a summer that had changed everything, a man who had been part of the town's fabric for decades was led from his home in a pair of plain, matte handcuffs. The local news vans arrived like a swarm, lights off out of respect at first, and then, by the time the mayor made his statement, flashing with the kind of intensity that makes small places feel like cities. Someone on the courthouse steps whispered the name, and the town leaned in as though it could hold the man's fate in its collective breast. He was not a name anyone expected. He was not a stranger who'd come through and left wreckage. He was a name people trusted. He taught Sunday school. He put money into the Little League Fund. He officiated weddings and cut ribbons and smiled into cameras at charity drives. He had been photographed at the high school prom in '03, where he'd been a chaperone and had posed awkwardly by the punch bowl. The same smile he wore now, kindly, practiced, familiar. When the arrest was announced, the charges read in a plain, even voice by a state detective who had arrived from Portland with a folder thick with paperwork. The words felt foreign because the town had spent 2 decades learning the language of absence instead. They had said missing, gone, unfound. They knew how to say grief. They did not know how to say arrest and evidence, like a neat package packed all those years ago and finally opened with modern hands. Lily March had been 21 when she disappeared in July of 2004. Everyone remembered Lily. Her laugh, the way she tucked her hair behind an ear, the freckles on the bridge of her nose that the sunlight turned into constellations. She'd worked at the diner on Route 7, the one with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that tasted like metal if you ordered it black. She wanted to leave Hawthorn. She had told anyone who would listen that she would see the ocean one day and work in a bookshop and never again be known by the narrow town lines that seemed to shrink around every dream. On the night Lily vanished, there had been a county fair in town. Cotton candy, fireworks, teenagers making promises under the whir of the Ferris wheel. That evening, Lily finished her shift late, took a walk home beneath a sky the color of bruised ripe plums, and stopped by the payphone near the florist on Main to call her sister. The payphone, people remembered with strange precision even now, had a leaning metal sign and a flickering light above it. The last person to see her was a man who had stopped to tie his shoe, who sat on the stand at the convenience store later that night for hours until his hands went numb with guilt because he'd told himself someone else would call. A friend of a friend drove by and waved. Lily waved back. That was the last ordinary thing. Then the ordinary split. The hours turned over like a film reel stuck between scenes. Lily did not arrive home. Her apartment was found with one shoe by the door and makeup still in a small bag on her dresser. Her keys were gone. Her car was in the lot, its engine cold. The diner's cash register was balanced, the coffee pot empty. And in the morning the town moved into a second, heavier season. Suspicion. Suspicions pulled at the seams of Hawthorn. Secrets the town had learned to live with, small betrayals and old jealousies, swelled into accusations. People who had been cordial in church grew cold at the grocery store. Couples whispered. Teenagers rehashed the night in the grocery aisle while flipping through packs of gum. The police did their work the only way they'd been taught. They asked questions. They took statements. They combed the fields at the edge of town with dogs that patted and pricked their ears and found nothing. Years blurred. Leads evaporated into thin air. A false confession on a rain-swept Tuesday turned out to be the words of a confused man who wanted attention more than absolution. A man with a history of petty crimes was arrested and then released when his alibi held. His story of being at a bar until closing time mapped to surveillance footage like a clean line. Lily's face was handed out in flyers, taped to telephone poles, laminated at the diner counters. Candlelight vigils came and went. The town grew used to the ache. People learned to live with night. When the new detective, Jonah Price, rolled into town 2 years ago and asked to see the box of cold case evidence, the old hands at the station shrugged the way people do when bureaucracy arrives with bureaucracy. They showed him the files, stacks of paper, photocopies with handwritten notes, a plastic evidence bag containing a scrap of fabric, a matchbook from a bar that closed in 2005, a nickel, a red hairpin, items dried as though preserved in amber. Price had been on other cold cases. He carried a folder that smelled faintly of coffee and ozone and the kind of optimism that comes from being good at seeing patterns others miss. He spent days at the station and nights at the diner, where he sipped coffee and stirred it with a stick like an old man. He listened. He had a method. He reread statements like lines of scripture, looking for confession in the margins. He sent old evidence to a lab that could do things smaller, more precise than the tools available in 2004. He re-interviewed witnesses who had aged into new versions of themselves, children who were now parents, mothers wearing glasses they never needed before. The discovery that led to the arrest was not the stuff of dramatic luck. It was, in its way, smaller and more technical. A tiny piece of DNA, so degraded it was like ash, was found on the inside rim of a coffee cup that had been bagged and stored in evidence. In 2004, the tests couldn't use such a fragment. The science then needed meteor samples, not the trace whispers left by hands that had been in other places. Newer techniques, however, coaxed secrets out of the smallest cells. The lab ran the sample through a newer sequencer and matched it not to a person in the system, but to a familial database that had been created for other purposes. The match came with a probability and a chain, a relative distant, who had allowed their DNA, a ghost in the modern age, to point back toward someone in Hawthorn. Once Price had a person of interest, he dug into everything. The man's life was a tapestry of contradictions. He had been licit in public and messy in private. He'd been loyal to the community's rituals, Boy Scout leader, PTA supporter. But there were lines in his background that pulled curious shadows into the light. Old complaints filed and dismissed. A broken marriage that had left him more closed off than before. He hadn't left town in years. He lived in a house that had been painted 3 tones of beige over its history, its porch sagging under the weight of the decades. The man's name, when Price said it at the press conference, required a moment for the town to put it all together because his civic face had worn well. Arrests break the ordinary into sharp pieces. The accused, arrested in his pajamas with a cup of tea beside him and a Bible on the kitchen table, looked like a man waking from sleep rather than one being led toward ruin. His hands trembled ever so slightly when they cuffed him. Neighbors, watching from behind lace curtains, said later that his wife came out in a robe and asked the officers what they were doing as though she expected a delivery. The initial charge was for murder. The state presented enough circumstantial threads to hold a person under custody. The DNA, the timeline, the places he'd been that summer, the testimony that his car had been seen on Route 7 near the payphone that night. The courtroom smelled like old wood and anxiety and the clack of a recorder. Families filled the front rows. Lily's mother had stayed away for the arraignment. She said later she couldn't sit through the first scene of that long play in which she still had no lines that made sense. Public reaction split the town cleanly along a fault line that had been cracking for years. Some prayed in the church and said God had finally given them a measure of justice. Others stood on street corners and shouted that nothing would bring Lily back, Arrest was an inadequate band-aid on a wound that had infected the town for 2 decades. The accused friends and family insisted he was innocent. They had known him for years. They thought of 1,000 small acts of kindness he had performed, feeding stray cats, fixing a neighbor's fence, and said none of that could be squared with the jagged possibility he'd been accused of. Inside the interrogation room, the man was quieter than the news made him out to be. Detective Price did not storm in with thunder. He sat opposite with a thin file and a glass of water. He spoke in short sentences, finding connective tissue rather than trying to tear it. He asked the man, whose name was Samuel Hale, about the night of July 10, 2004. Samuel said he remembered the fare. He remembered buying a hot dog for his daughter and listening to a band rehearse. He said he'd been driving home late and had stopped at the payphone to ask for directions. He told this story calmly, like a man reciting the weather. Price knew how to listen for the way people told the weather. He also had a longer game. He presented the DNA match not as a knockout blow. In courts, DNA is a powerful thing, but not an absolute one, but as a needle threading through a spool. He presented phone records, receipts, a neighbor's testimony, the tail of a shirt found in a trash can behind a service station and later tested for fibers that would tie it to Lily's coat. There were inconsistencies. Samuel flapped his hands and asked for an attorney. He muttered that he had nothing to do with Lily. He shook and told Price about the way the town had always had a hard edge and how the town's attention felt like a furnace when it turned toward you. The story that spilled out of the old notebooks and witness logs and the man's own guarded statements was, in parts, painfully ordinary. It was a story that unfolded around small decisions, a detour for a pack of cigarettes, a drink with an old friend, a forgotten promise, that together created an invisible architecture for tragedy. There were moments where Samuel's accounts bent like reeds in the wind. His memory of time slid. Time is slippery in a way that helps criminals sometimes, and it also helps towns forget the precise configuration of a wound. But the science, the decades of policing, and the weight of testimony were building a case. Still, arrests do not equal proof. Sam's wife organized kitchen table meetings with a group of supporters who circulated petitions and wrote letters to a local paper about the dangers of rush to judgment. The prosecutor, a woman who had made a name for herself in the state for refusing to be swayed by the fashion of public outrage, promised a careful process. Court filings grew fat with expert reports. Lawyers negotiated access to old files. The town sat in a kind of limbo that made old wounds ache anew. Underneath the legal theater, a different kind of drama played out in small, private places. Lily's sister, Mara, had left Hawthorn not long after Lily vanished. She lived in Seattle now, and had learned to live with the ache in the way people learn to live with winter, by getting better coats. But the arrest reopened corridors she'd built new walls around. She drove back when the dad van was returned to the town for processing. She walked the payphone. She tried to hold Lily's last movements in her hands like a map she could fold and study. In the evenings, she read Lily's old emails aloud in her motel room, until the words sounded like spells she could cast to keep the dead present. The closer they came to the trial, the more the town split into factions. The local bar became a battlefield of quiet fury. People argued over pints and over what constituted proof. Old friends stopped speaking. A PDA meeting dissolved into shouting. The mayor called for calm in his official statement, but the statement itself felt like a thin wafer between two hungry worlds. The prosecution's case relied on an array of small certainties knit together. That Samuel's vehicle was in the area that night, that his phone pinged near the payphone shortly before midnight, that someone had seen a man matching his description near Lily's car the morning after, that DNA on the evidence matched a relative sample, that fibers from Samuel's jacket could be linked to the fabric found at the scene. The defense tinkered with each link like a surgeon trying to mend a chain. They suggested contamination. They presented alibis that leaned on faded memories and records that might as well have been smudged in the intervening years. Then came the witness that altered public sentiment in a way that could not be contained. A woman named Donna Miller, who had been 27 in 2004, came forward. Donna had worked at the county dump that summer a place people only half noticed on the outskirts of town. She told the court in a measured voice that she had been sorting through some of the day's refuse on a humid August morning and found a small, folded piece of fabric stuck in a tire tread. At the time, she tossed it into a bin and moved on. She had not known why she had done so. Years later, watching coverage of the renewed investigation, she felt a prickle, a thread of conscience, and asked for that piece of evidence to be tested. When it was, the fabric's fibers matched the lining of a jacket taken from Samuel for testing. Her testimony crackled through the town like static. Some said it was a miracle of conscience. Others said it was a convenient memory sprung to life. The defense tried to make the memory suspect by pointing out Donna's previous lack of action. Why had she not handed the cloth in when she first found it? Why had she not reported the find? Why, they asked, did it take 20 years for her to recall that small thing? Donna's answer was small and human. The dump was a place where time went to die, she said. People don't often think their finds will matter. She said she had been young and scared. She said she had moved away and then moved back, and that age and grief had rearranged her priorities. Her voice trembled, not from stage fright, but from bearing a truth she could have kept and had once kept. The town argued in the press, on social media, at gravesides. Lily's mother, who had carried grief like a cloak, was suddenly being offered the cruel bargain of closure in a marketplace crowded with skepticism. The accused teenage daughter posted a photograph in black and white with the caption, "Not my father." She was 12 in 2004. She had grown up hearing Lily's name in whispers like a ghost story told at sleepovers. Now she found herself pressed into the middle of the story. She said later that she did not know if her father had done anything wrong. She only knew that her childhood had been a collage of his small acts of kindness and his private silences. Trial days turned into a slow burn. Journalists from Portland filed their stories. A documentary crew knocked on a few doors, their cameras polite but hungry. The courtroom itself saw the least of the drama. The real ruptures happened in living rooms over casseroles and at kitchen tables where people unfolded their opinions, finding themselves more certain than they'd ever been about the shape of truth. On the 10th week of the trial, the defense called a surprise witness, an ex-lover of Lily's from high school named Caleb, a man who had been an undercurrent in the town's gossip for reasons that had nothing to do with the court. He took the stand and told a story that stitched a seam through the past no one had expected. He spoke, haltingly, about a night in June 2000, for when Lily had confided that she was afraid of someone she could not name. She had said it in a joking tone, Caleb testified, and then become more serious. She had told him that someone had followed her home once, and that she'd felt watched. Caleb had not told anyone at the time, because teenagers think adults will overreact, because they think their secrets will outlive them safely, because sometimes the need to be normal is louder than the need to be safe. The admission did two things. It widened the field of suspicion and deepened the tragedy. It suggested that Lily had been living in caution in her own town, that fear had been a background hum. It also made the prosecution's case thicker, that someone in the town had been watching her, that the danger had been local and patient. Then, in a twist that stunned even the most weathered members of the jury, an email surfaced. It was from 2004 and had been saved on an old hard drive that Samuel's son had lumbered through when clearing out a garage. The email was sent from a private account Lily had used and was addressed to an unnamed contact. It read, in fragmented lines that sounded unbearably young, "I think someone knows where I go at night. I keep seeing the same truck. I might be paranoid. I hate thinking like this. I have to leave soon." The email had been unsent to most people because it had been saved as a draft and never sent. Its existence was a kind of cruel evidence, the idea that she had thought to speak into the ether and had not completed the plea. The defense argued that drafts are the province of anxiety. The prosecutor suggested drafts are also the footprints of intent. The jury, made up of neighbors and teachers and a woman who taught pottery on Main Street, sat in their glass box like a battery that could power a town's hope or its sorrow. On the final day of testimony, Detective Price took the stand. He explained, with the patience of someone who had poured his life into another person's absence, the path from a brittle scrap of DNA to an arrest, the lab's process, the chain of custody, the corroborating phone records, the small physical matches. He spoke about the town in the voice of someone who had come to love it not because it was picturesque, but because it had been wounded and brave enough to keep going. He talked about the quiet perseverance of the family, the dog-eared flyers, the vigils. He did not make the kind of impassioned speech that movies like. He was careful with his words because he knew the law was not a place for sentiment. When the jury left for deliberation, the courthouse exhaled. People in the hallways whispered like fruit flies. The family of Lily sat together, a knot of new and old grief. Sam's family held each other too, their faces etched with a different kind of fear. The jury returned the next day, and the forewoman stood. The verdict was unanimous. Guilty. The word landed in the courthouse like a physical blow. There were sounds that were not crying and not cheering, but something that had both salt and relief in it. Lily's mother wept openly, and then held herself up as if by habit, the way people do when there is a long road ahead and they must keep walking. Sam's daughter collapsed into her mother's arms and sobbed. Members of the community gathered at the steps, some hugging, some mouthing the name Justice, as if repeating it could make it true in a fuller way. The sentence that followed was long but measured. The judge's voice was not for performance. She spoke of the evidence, of the cruelty of a life cut off, of the slow, expensive machinery of law catching up finally to a man who had once been allowed into the town's inner circle. She spoke of the files with their moth-eaten corners, of the detective's perseverance, of the townspeople who had not given up. But the story does not end at a verdict. The arrest and conviction were not tidy. Inside the prison, Samuel maintained his innocence. He wrote letters that were barely legible at times and sent them to a handful of supporters who printed them and read them like scripture. Outside, the town found itself in pieces that could be mended but not quite matched. People argued about where blame truly lived. Some believed there had been a cover-up, that too many people had known something and no one had spoken. Others took the easier path of closure and began cautiously to believe in a world where mistakes could be rectified. There were other consequences. The local paper printed a lengthy editorial about small towns and secrets and the difficulty of reconciling the two. The diner changed its coffee maker out of superstition. The payphone by the florist was removed and sold at auction to a collector who framed a chip of its paint for display, a token of the way places carry history in their hardware. Lily's mother moved to a cottage on the coast. She liked the sound of waves because it seemed to breathe with her. And yet, the cliff that the town had stepped away from remained a crevice of questions. Some details never quite settled. There were witnesses whose memories had shifted in ways that made people wonder what else had been missed. There were absences that were still absences, like holes in a sweater that no one could stitch perfectly. There were rumors of other, unreported incidents that surfaced in conversations meant to be private. The conviction closed one chapter, but it also opened others, about complacency, about the town's willingness to trust certain kinds of people, about the corrosive kindness that could be confused with innocence. In the months after the trial, a journalist with a national magazine arrived, interested not just in the case, but in what it revealed about small-town dynamics. She interviewed survivors of other crimes in the county. She sat with people who had been friends with Samuel for years and asked them questions that felt, to some, like knives. The magazine piece was long and colored the town in shades no one expected. It suggested that the case might not be an isolated act, but part of a pattern that had gone unnoticed, because the victims were often young and transient, passing through the town with plans to leave. An old file, not part of the prosecution's case, drifted into the hands of a freelance researcher who had been drawn to Hawthorn's story. It was a police report from a neighboring county, a report that had been dismissed in 2005 as a mislaid complaint but had some similarities. A young woman, an unmarked truck, a late-night disappearance that had not been solved. The researcher mentioned it in passing on a podcast, and then realized, with a small hitch of adrenaline, that the truck described matched an owner's model that had been registered to someone in Hawthorn in 2004. The researcher contacted the detective who had originally worked the Lily case, and together they reopened old maps of movement. The new documents pushed a cold wind through the town. People who had thought they understood the scope of the events found their horizons widening in ways that felt dangerous. If patterns existed, they suggested an architecture of violence that might have touched other lives. The arrest and conviction may have provided one solution, but it had also illuminated a shape of problem that might not be solved by a single judgment. The story, then, ended like the last frame of a film left in place. The credits rolled but began again. Hawthorn felt different in the springs that followed. Children played differently in the park. Parents hovered in a new way. People who had been too eager to greet new faces at the post office found themselves asking more questions. The annual county fair, once a carousel of carefree summer nights, acquired a shadowed undercurrent. But life persisted because life always does. The diner still served pie. The pastor still mended broken pots. The river still carried leaves downstream. And for Lily, there were small mercies. Her name that once whispered through the town on flyers was now spoken in court transcripts and in news articles bearing the dignity of someone more than a missing person. Her sister kept a folded photograph in a wallet, and sometimes late at night, she spoke to the empty house where Lily had last been seen and told her everything that had happened. It felt, in its way, like an act of reclamation. Yet even as the arrest provided a measure of relief for some, it also left an uncomfortable residue. How many more LLEs were there? How many more connections had gone unnoticed because people had been too polite, too trusting, too busy? The town rehearsed these questions without answers, like a town that had been taught to whisper and now found it had to learn to shout. The final scene, even after the verdict, belonged not to a courthouse, but to a stretch of road outside town where the payphone once stood. A child on a bicycle stopped where the phone had been and picked at a patch of gravel with a stick. The child found a chip of paint, blue as a summer sky, and held it up like a relic. There are objects in life that carry more meaning than the sum of their parts. The child pocketed the chip and pedaled away, unaware of the weight it once bore. And the town kept watching, not because it had nothing better to do, but because living with a wound has a way of training you to look for its echoes. People began to tell stories differently now, with caution, with curiosity, with an eye toward the small, easily overlooked things. They learned to ask questions without assuming they would always be grateful for the answers. They learned that closure is rarely a clean line, but is often a knot of threads you learn to wear. The arrest had shocked the community, as the title promised, but it also forced the town to reckon with the ordinary ways danger can grow, in the smiles of men who seem kind, in the assurances we accept without probing, in the cultural silences we keep to preserve a comfortable image. Samuel Hale's conviction closed a dark, long chapter of unanswered questions. But the real, stubborn work of understanding why Lily had been vulnerable, how a town might better protect those at the margins, whether there were other threads to follow, began only then. The end, if it can be called that, is not a neat punctuation but a comma. There were appeals and petitions and new questions that rose like minnows in a pond when the water begins to stir. Someone found a photograph in an attic that suggested a truck had been in a place it was not supposed to be. A woman in the next county remembered seeing a light on a road at night and wondered why she had not been asked about it before. An old police report, misfiled, was finally uncovered. And in the middle of Hawthorn, beneath the banner of the county fairground lights, someone whispered that the story was not yet over. So the town sits with its verdict like a hand over a bruise, pressed for a moment, then careful, the way you test to see if it still hurts. They walk on. They argue. They keep vigil. They plant flowers on a wooden cross in the yard where, once, someone had left candles. They tell a new generation that the world is sometimes larger than the map you draw for it. And somewhere beneath the surface, the threads keep moving, some toward resolution, some into the dark. Then, months after the conviction, a slip of paper turns up in an evidence file that had been overlooked. A receipt for a motel room in a town 30 miles away, stamped July 11, 2004. The hand that had written the name on the receipt was different from the others. The ink smudged as though written in a hurry. Detective Price found it when he was cleaning his office late, and the lights were low, and the world outside his window seemed to hold its breath. He looked at the date, at the motel's name, and felt the old, familiar sting of something unresolved. He called the clerk listed on the receipt. The clerk remembered a vehicle that had been registered under a different man's name, but that matched a truck he'd seen in the parking lot the night the reservation had been made. The clerk remembered vaguely, like a half-remembered tune, that the truck had been older, green, with a faint dent along the passenger side. It was a detail, but details are sometimes all you have. Price packed the receipt into an envelope and drove to the motel at dawn. The owner had sold it years ago. The new owner, a woman with a tattoo of a swallow on her wrist, told him the rooms had been papered over and repainted. But she also gave him something, an old ledger, a book of names that the previous owner had kept in a back drawer because he liked to know who came through. The ledger was dusty and smelled like cigarette smoke. Price flipped the pages and found the entry, July 11th, 2004. A name scrawled across, a phone number that was faded but legible. Price dialed. The number connected to a man who answered with a voice that made him think of winter. The man said he remembered renting a room that night because his truck had been overheating and he needed to sleep and check in the morning. He remembered a woman across the parking lot who had been crying. His voice tightened with memory and then closed with practiced carefulness. "I don't want to talk," he said. "You don't know what something like this does to a town." Price had heard that before. It was an excuse and a plea and a confession all in one. He booked a plane ticket that afternoon and drove out of town with a file that had gained new weight. He had a feeling that was not the same as the first time he had felt it. This was older and laced with the sense of an unfinished sentence. He did not know whether the receipt would lead to a second conviction, or to an exoneration, or to nothing at all. He only knew that somewhere in the ledger of a motel there might be another truth waiting, patient as a seed. The handcuffs had clapped down once, and a man had been led away. The town had exhaled. But the sound Price heard in the back of his skull as he drove across county lines was not the sound of a final breath. It was the rustle of more pages turning. Price drove until the sky went thin and the road narrowed into two lanes that smelled of pine and hot asphalt. The motel sat like a tired tooth beside the highway, neon long since faded into a ghost of red. He pushed the door open with a key the clerk had slid across a counter, and the room remembered him for a moment before it forgot again. A brass lamp, a sagging mattress, the faint curl of cigarette smoke trapped in the curtains. He moved like someone who had learned to expect that objects could whisper if handled right. He started where the ledger had pointed, the little drawer under the nightstand, the seam where someone had once pried up a board and then pressed it back down with clumsy hands. It yielded after a moment, as if grateful to be useful. A shoebox lay inside, taped at the corners with yellowing tape. Price slid it open and found a nest of things that made his stomach drop into his boots. A handful of motel receipts, a locket tarnished with the smudge of a thumb, a folded scrap of a dress with a pattern he did not know but suspected he would never forget. There were Polaroids, heat-warped and sun-browned at the edges. He thumbed through them slowly, because some part of him hoped to find nothing and couldn't stand that hope failing. The first photograph showed a teenager he recognized immediately by the freckles lifted to a smile, Lily, seated on the edge of a motel bed. She looked younger than the last image he had seen in court, a different dress, hair in a braid that made her look almost innocent. Around her, 3 men leaned in like they belonged to her. Price studied their faces. One was an older man, hair silked back the way the mayor wore it in civic photos. Another was broad-shouldered with the kind of hands that could fix anything, the town's high school coach who had signed autographs for boys at the fair. The third was less easy to place, but there was a cold familiarity to his eyes. For a long instant, Price felt the room tilt. The Polaroids were not the kind of thing people took for their scrapbooks. They were intimate, too intimate for something ordinary. He counted the photos with the clinical dispassion of someone cataloging evidence. Lily standing at a motel sink, Lily laughing with her mouth open. Lily's wrist leaned over the collarbone of a man whose tie was loosened, as if celebration and calculation shared the same breath. In the corner of one frame, almost cropped out, there was a small tattoo, an anchor, the kind of mark you didn't forget if you were from Hawthorn. Price knew where that anchor might be seen on a Sunday roster. He cataloged, photographed, bagged, marked. Each object felt like a hand pulling at a stitch on a sweater. Pull enough and the whole thing might unravel. Price called his supervisor and then the state squad. He did not sleep that night. He sat on the motel bed and watched the streetlight paint the ceiling in slow, exhausted circles. And he thought of the ledger entry, the motel clerk's memory, the man who had claimed he did not want to talk. He thought of Samuel in a cell miles away, writing letters that were faiths of denial. When the warrants went out, the town did not know what would come through its doors. It woke to the sound of engines and the rattle of cuffs. Men who had stood in parades, who had cut ribbons, who had patted children on the head at ball games were led from their houses with eyes that did not match the faces the town had known. The pastor, in collar and hands folded as though still mid-sermon, walked with officers whose faces were set like winter. The coach, who had kissed young players on the top of their heads and told them to keep their chins up, left with a baseball cap askew. A third man, the owner of the very bar where Samuel had once been seen the night before Lily vanished, was also taken. No one in Hawthorn had expected that. The town's center of gravity had been Samuel's arrest. It had been neat, contained, a single book closed. These arrests turned the book inside out. The first shock came not from the prison vans, but from what the teams carried out of the coach's garage. A wooden trunk full of photographs, letters, and a stack of small, plain envelopes each labeled in a cramped hand with women's names. Lily's name, Price found, was written on the last envelope with a line scored across the corner. Inside it, a pressed piece of address, a scrap of handwriting that said, "For safekeeping," and a rusted key on a ring. The key's teeth were worn like a dog's molar, used often, then hidden for a long time. The coach had never left town in years. His life was a field, the scoreboard, a neat record no one had thought to question until the town's bones began to creak under the weight of new evidence. The pastor's study yielded an even colder prize, a leather-bound journal in which initials were circled and dates annotated. The entries were not all in the pastor's neat hand. Some were scrawled, some barely legible, but one line sliced Price like glass. "We keep them close. For the town. For the quiet." The page beneath it had a list of places, motels, a storage unit, a shed behind the fairgrounds, and beside each place a tiny check mark. The checks matched dates around years when women had gone missing. The town reacted the way towns do when their proper stories collapse. Some people stood on their porches and watched the police vans carry their own into judgment like carting off a neighbor's illness. Others attended an emergency meeting in the church basement, where truths unspooled into accusations. The mayor called for calm and in the same breath announced his resignation, his voice a blanket of words that did little to keep out the cold. Television vans returned, and this time the faces beneath the cameras were different. They were stunned, not voyeuristic. One by one, people who had once nodded at the men now sat in the dark of living rooms and tried to reconcile the hands that had baptized children with the photographs that had pictured them in flickering motel light. A woman who had taught Sunday school for 30 years insisted on sitting in the gallery, as if to see whether the faces she loved could be the ones who had made a life of theft. Lily's mother, who had moved to that cottage by the sea, came back for the arraignments. She walked into the courtroom and placed the locket, the one Price had found in the shoebox, on the bench like an offering. She looked at the men being charged, and the tears that came from her were not only for Lily now, but for every woman whose name had been folded into an envelope and hidden away. The locket was small. It contained a picture of Lily at 16. The freckles spread like constellations across what had been a face of whole things. As the county prosecutor laid out the new case, the trunk, the envelopes, the circles in the journal, the ledger, the air in the courtroom felt electric and rotten all at once. There was a sense that the town had been living with a neat explanation, and that truth, when it arrived, threw everything into disorder. People who had once been pillars felt the ground give beneath them. Then the shock deepened in a way that made the town reel. As the evidence was presented, an old woman in the back of the courtroom stood up. She was 80, bent as a willow, and she had been present at the county fair the summer Lily disappeared. Her name was Edna, and she had been the person who ran the sewing circle at the community center for decades. She said she had been too frightened to tell what she knew back then. She described a summer night decades ago when a group of men had come to the fair with pockets full of coupons and secrets. She spoke of a van with a dented passenger side and an anchor tattoo on the driver's wrist. She said, almost as if apologizing, that she had thrown away a string of photographs she had found in a transistor radio case behind an awning. She had been young then and afraid and thought it would make no difference. She had married, had children, and had been silent. But the arrests had unearthed something in her, a conscience that had been sleeping with the others. Her voice quivered and the court listened. It was not merely what she said, but the way the ledger and the trunk and Edna's memory converged that shook Hawthorn. Patterns began to clear like fog. Men who had been thought to be kind, who had been handed the town's trust with a smile, were now recognizable in old photographs, their faces present at places they claimed they had not been. The community that had once been a single organism found itself cut along old lines into new, raw places. But the most chilling moment came not from the arrests, nor from the trunk, nor even from Edna's confession. It came 10 days later, when Price received a single white envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside was a Polaroid, Lily at 19, laughing as if the world had a secret to tell her. And beneath it 3 words in a hand he recognized instantly because he had seen it on the envelopes in the trunk. "We're sorry." There were no signatures. No further instruction, just the photograph and the 3 small, impossible words. Price sat at his kitchen table and let the paper tremble in his fingers. The apology was not relief. It was a kind of prayer that would not be answered. For the town, it was the sound of a wound reopening. The arrests unfolded into criminal proceedings that would dominate headlines for months. The accused men went to trial in shifts, and the community watched as the town's myth of itself was stripped away layer by layer. Some denied everything. Some pleaded. Some pleaded guilty in a way that made the sermons of their youth seem like stage props. And yet, even with cuffed wrists and courtroom testimony, the town would not settle. People began to find more envelopes in places no one expected. A rusted cooler behind the community center, a shoebox in the rafters of the church basement, a jar buried beneath the floor of a storage unit that contained another locket and a single brittle curl of dark hair. Each find opened new wounds and asked new questions. At the end of that long, terrible week, as the county fair's empty field lay under a gray sky and the bandstand stood without its bunting, Lily's sister climbed the little hill where, years ago, they had watched fireworks and tried to hold onto the color of joy. She clutched a Polaroid in her hand and looked down at the town she had left and returned to see in pieces. She thought of the envelopes and the journals, and the way people who seemed safe had been unsafe. She walked down and placed Lily's photograph on the ground, and then, with a movement both gentle and fierce, kicked up a little dirt that broke and fell back like an old promise disturbed. From the hill, the town looked smaller and more brittle. People walked the streets, as if testing them with soles that did not yet fit. They had been shocked, yes, shocked to the bone. But what would be more ruinous than shock was what followed. The daily work of asking whether they had been blind, and what they owed to those they had not seen. The last thing the town learned, bitter and true, was that some beds of secrets are so well tended that even a decade of rain will not wash them out. And as night fell, someone on Main Street found an envelope tucked under the payphone's broken coin slot, the payphone that had been sold and shipped away, and inside was a single scrap of paper with a single instruction: look under the fairground lights. The instruction was not a promise of closure. It was an invitation. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and turn on the notification bell, so you stay updated with mystery stories that strike a chord. Thanks for watching.